3 seconds. That's how long it takes for a pressure cooker bomb to change everything. 3 seconds, and two brothers nobody stopped turned a celebration into a crime scene and a spring afternoon into one of America's darkest days. But here's the thing that will haunt you long after this story ends. The FBI knew. They had names, they had warnings, they had time. And somehow, Dzhokhar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev walked right through every safety net America had built after September 11th, and nobody caught them. This is not just a story about a bombing. This is a story about what happens when intelligence becomes noise, when warnings become paperwork, and when the system designed to protect you falls asleep at the wheel. April 15th, 2013. Patriots Day in Boston. 26,000 runners, 500,000 spectators, flags, cheers, children sitting on the curb eating pretzels, waiting to see their parents cross the finish line. It was everything America loves about itself: community, endurance, celebration. And at 2:49 in the afternoon, two explosions tore through Boylston Street, 12 seconds and 210 yards apart. 3 people died. 264 were wounded. 16 people lost limbs. The blast radius was small. The psychological damage was enormous. Within hours, investigators were combing through thousands of hours of surveillance footage. Within 4 days, they had faces. Within 5 days, they had names. But what the world didn't fully understand in those first breathless days of the manhunt was something far more disturbing. The FBI already had those names. They had them almost 2 years before the bombs went off. Go back to March of 2011. Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB, successor to the KGB, sent a formal written request to the FBI. The message was direct and alarming. They had intelligence suggesting that Tamerlan Tsarnaev, a 24-year-old legal permanent resident living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, had become a follower of radical Islam. The Russians believed he was preparing to travel to Russia to connect with underground extremist groups. They asked the Americans to look into him. This wasn't a vague tip. This wasn't rumor. This was a foreign intelligence agency with its own surveillance apparatus, raising a red flag about a man living on American soil. The FBI opened what's called a threat assessment. Agents interviewed Tamerlan. They interviewed his family. They searched databases. They reviewed his communications. And then, after several months, they closed the file. Their conclusion: no derogatory information, no link to terrorism, no further action required. Tamerlan Tsarnaev was cleared and forgotten. But the Russians weren't satisfied. In September 2011, the FSB sent a second warning, this time not just to the FBI, but to the CIA as well. Same message, same concern, same name. The CIA added Tamerlan to the Terrorist Identities Data Mart environment, a massive watch list maintained by the intelligence community. But critical information was never shared with the local Joint Terrorism Task Force in Boston. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. A system built precisely to prevent this kind of communication breakdown was already breaking down. And then Tamerlan did exactly what the Russians said he would. In January 2012, he boarded a plane and flew to Russia. He spent 6 months there, in Dagestan, a volatile republic in the North Caucasus where extremist networks had deep roots. What he did there, who he met, what he was taught, investigators would later piece it together like a puzzle with missing pieces. He returned to the United States in July 2012, and nobody stopped him. Nobody flagged his return. Nobody reopened his file. He came back radicalized, focused, and planning. What's extraordinary, and what should make every American deeply uncomfortable, is what federal investigators found after the bombing. On Tamerlan's computer, they discovered videos of radical Islamic clerics, bomb-making instructions, extremist propaganda. His YouTube channel was filled with content celebrating jihad. His social media presence was a roadmap of radicalization. None of it was hidden. All of it was accessible. But nobody was looking anymore, because officially, the case was closed. His younger brother Dzhokhar was a different story on the surface. 19 years old, a college student at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. His friends described him as laid back, funny, the kind of guy who would give you the shirt off his back. Teachers liked him. Classmates hung out with him. Nobody saw what was happening beneath the surface. Or more precisely, nobody was looking for it. Because once again, the family had been assessed and cleared. They were no longer a priority. After the bombing, the congressional investigation into the intelligence failures was withering. The Senate Intelligence Committee's review found that the FBI's initial investigation of Tamerlan was conducted inadequately. Agents failed to interview his friends and associates. They failed to check social media, which was already a publicly available goldmine of radicalizing content. They failed to coordinate properly with local law enforcement, who might have had additional context. And when the case was closed, there was no mechanism to flag it for re-examination if new information emerged. The file just sat there, silent, waiting. The Joint Terrorism Task Force in Boston, the very unit that should have been the connective tissue between federal intelligence and local action, was never fully read in on the Russian warnings. The CIA had information the FBI field office didn't have. The FBI headquarters had context that agents in Boston lacked. After more than a decade of post-9/11 reform, after billions of dollars spent building fusion centers and information-sharing networks, the same silo problem that allowed 9/11 to happen was still there, just wearing different clothes. Former FBI Director Robert Mueller defended the investigation, arguing that agents followed proper procedures given the information they had. And there's something to that. In 2011, the FBI was simultaneously tracking hundreds of threat leads. Resources were stretched. Priorities were constantly shifting. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, at the time of his initial assessment, hadn't done anything overtly illegal. In a free society, believing in radical ideology is not a crime. The line between monitoring someone and surveilling them without cause is thin, legally fraught, and constitutionally significant. But those arguments, however valid, feel hollow when you stand at the corner of Boylston and Exeter Street. When you think about Martin Richard, the 8-year-old boy who had gone to watch the marathon with his family and never came home. When you think about Crystal Campbell, 29 years old, who went to cheer on a friend and was killed by the first blast. When you think about Lingzi Lu, a Boston University graduate student from China who died in the second. When you think about the 16 people who woke up that morning with 2 legs and went to sleep that night with 1 or none. The Tsarnaev brothers were not masterminds with elaborate networks. They were not funded by foreign governments. They were not part of a sophisticated sleeper cell. They were 2 angry young men with a pressure cooker, some nails, some BBS, and instructions they found on the internet. The weapons were crude. The ideology was imported. The radicalization happened in plain sight. And the warning signs were in a closed FBI file, gathering digital dust. Tamerlan Tsarnaev died in a gunfight with police in Watertown, Massachusetts, 4 days after the bombing. His brother Dzhokhar was found hiding in a dry-docked boat in a backyard, bleeding, cornered. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. He remains on federal death row today. Justice, in its legal sense, was served. But justice, in a deeper sense, the justice of accountability, of systemic reckoning, of honest answers, has been slower and more elusive. The intelligence community acknowledged failures in information sharing. Protocols were updated, training was revised, watch list procedures were tightened, but no single official was disciplined. No one lost their job. The machine recalibrated and moved on. What Boston taught us, what it should have permanently burned into the institutional memory of American law enforcement, is that intelligence without action is just information. A warning unheeded is the same as no warning at all. The Russians sent 2 formal alerts. The CIA maintained a watch list entry. The FBI opened a file, found nothing alarming on the surface, and moved on. Every step, individually, might have seemed reasonable. Collectively, they formed a corridor of missed opportunities wide enough to walk 2 bombers straight through to the finish line. We build systems, we design protocols, we invest in technology and training and interagency coordination. And then we discover that systems are only as good as the human beings running them. Human beings who are tired, overwhelmed, working with incomplete information, and trying to distinguish real threats from the thousands of false alarms that fill their inboxes every single day. That's not an excuse. It's a warning. Because the next Tamerlan Tsarnaev is out there right now. Somewhere, a file is being reviewed and closed. Somewhere, a warning from a foreign partner is being logged and filed. Somewhere, a young man is watching videos online that are pulling him toward violence. And somewhere, a database has his name. But nobody is connecting the dots. The Boston Marathon finish line has a new tradition now. Every year, in memory of those lost, the race goes on. The city runs. The crowds cheer. Life resumes its beautiful, defiant rhythm. But underneath that resilience lives a question that demands an honest answer. Not a political answer, not a bureaucratic one, but a human one. We had the warning. We had the name. We had the time. What will we do differently next time, before the clock runs out?